Now, there are cases where we may not want a portion of the class to be serialized. Maybe it's some very important data or some private data that we do not want to include in the file. Well, there is a way to prevent that because beforehand we would just take the entire contents of the class object and put it into the file. So if there is a specific member or several members that we do not want to include in the file, what we do is include the word transient when we declare the variable. So in our class definition, in the list of instance variables when we're declaring them, we would include the word transient. So let me give you an example. Maybe we don't want to include the social security number in our files. So we can do something like private transient int SSN. And what this simply means is whatever data is stored in this variable, it never gets sent to the output stream. So whenever we're writing everything to our file, it's omitted. Now, what happens if we read stuff from a file and we try to store something in a transient member? Well, it'll be as if nothing gets stored in there. So it's just going to be blank. So if we were to try to print the contents of it, it's either just going to be empty or it's going to be zero, depending on what the data type of that variable is. Now, depending on the compiler or IDE that you use, you may get a compiler warning when you try to do the serialization. The warning may say something like the following. The serializable class, and I just use foo here, but it's just some class, does not declare a static final serial version UID field of type long. What does this mean? Well, whenever we actually compile and run a program that does serialization, the serialization runtime takes a serializable class and associate it with a version number. And we call this the serial version UID. Think of this as just a unique ID number for that particular serializable class. And the reason why we use this is whenever we deserialize a file. Because what happens is we're reading contents from the file and we're trying to store into some class object. We have to make sure that the contents of that object fit in our program. If we use two completely different classes, this isn't going to work correctly. Now, if we typecast it the correct class, that might be okay, but we need to make sure that we're using the correct version of that class. Because what if I create a class and then I serialize some data to a file and then I make changes to the class and then I try to store stuff back into an object of the new class? It may have the same name, but the contents may be different. So the purpose of this ID is to make sure that they match, because if I create a new class, it's going to have a new and different serial version UID. So before we do any reading, we're going to compare the serial version UIDs of the two objects. So this information does get stored in the file as well. If they match, then we're good. But if they don't match, then we're going to get an error because I cannot store stuff in the object of this new class. So we're just using this ID to make sure that the data, or at least the class information for both objects are compatible with each other with respect to serialization. So how do we make this compile warning go away? Well, it is a warning, first of all, so it's not a big deal if we just leave it as is. But if you don't like the warning, we can actually create our own serial version UID for a serializable class. You can't do this with just ordinary classes. All we have to do is just create our own variable in the class. It has to be called serial version UID, it has to be static, it has to be final, and it has to be of type long. So if you remember, a long is just simply an integer, but we can store larger values in there. So let me give you an example. We could have something like this. Private static final long serial version UID equals 42L. This L over here just simply means that the value 42 is of type long. Do I have to have the L in there? Probably not, but it may produce another compiler warning. So the L in there forces 42 to be a long. So that means in this class, the serial version UID would be 42. And that would get stored in a file. And then if I deserialize, I'm going to compare this value with the class object to make sure that they match. And then we're good there. Do I have to have this? Like I said, no. If we do not declare our own serial version UID, then the serialization runtime will create one by default. It's just we're going to get the compile warning. So as I've hinted at, how we use this is we have the contents from the file. So we can think of this as our sender, and then we have our program, which we can think of as our receiver. So what's going to happen is we're going to compare the serial version UIDs of both the sender and the receiver. And as long as they match, then we're good. But if they don't match, then we're going to get an invalid class exception when we try to deserialize the object. So one of the reasons why that we would have this type is we want to make sure that the class object that we read and write are the same class. We have to make sure that they have the same name, they have the same data in there, all that. So as long as the two class objects are exactly identical to each other, then we can deserialize. And we use this serial version UID to make sure that these objects are exactly identical to each other.